I felt that I had done my job. Of 200 plus ambassadors in Washington, there is one that was heard in the Oval Office. There is one that stung in the White House. There is one that moved a Secretary of State to issue a persona non grata declaration. I think I did live up to my standing for humanity, my standing against inhumanity, and for calling it out, whether it was the humanity of the Palestinians or whether it was even the humanity of those who are on the other side of supremacist instincts.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. The world has been fascinated by the faltering bromance between the US President Donald Trump and the world's richest human, Elon Musk. Reactions ranged from astonishment to amusement. Some were dismayed, others dumbfounded. My guest today knows what it's like to be in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. Ebrahim Rasool was dismissed as South Africa's ambassador to the US earlier this year. He was declared persona non grata after being accused of being a, quote, race-baiting politician and a Trump hater. Well, I met the former ambassador here at the ENCA studio in Cape Town, and in a fascinating conversation, we discussed Trump, Musk, President Ramaphosa's Oval Office encounter, South African politics, and the Rainbow Nation's place in the world. Ambassador, it's good to have some time with you. It's been a while, actually, since I last saw you, and a lot has happened. Now, having come back a few months from the USA, are you glad to be home?
I think it's been great to be home. It's not where I expected to be. I would have preferred to have completed some of the objectives I had set myself for the US, but I think I did achieve one greater objective, and that is to really call out something that I think needed to be called out. And so in the light of that, I'm happy to be home.
Now, we'll go into detail on some of this stuff, but you got quite a hero's welcome. There were people at the airport, the media was there. Were you surprised?
I was surprised because I came back with doubts about how I would be received. Because I'm used to achieving my objectives, and in this case, I did not achieve the objective I had set out for. But when I saw hundreds of people at the airport, I think that I have achieved something bigger than the trade and tariff objectives that I may have set for myself.
Well, it's such a turbulent time, as we will go through, that perhaps the objectives would have been difficult anyway, but we can get into that. What did President Cyril Ramaphosa have to say about what happened, and so suddenly?
No, I think I spoke to the President the night of the issuing of the declaration of persona non grata. He had a sense of c'est la vie. This is the life that one lives under Donald Trump, that if it had not been that issue, it could have been another issue. If it had not been you, it could have been something else. And he was absolutely correct, because I think ultimately it came down to expelling the ambassador, which was relatively easy. You didn't have to give detailed reasons, or even, on the other hand, sanctioning the top leaders of the ANC, which was what was being called for at that moment. And I think in that regard, Secretary Rubio and President Trump acted in a way that was immediate, easy, and gave them a win.
Now that the dust has settled, what sort of feedback are you getting?
I must say that in the last 2 days especially, as the Trump presidency unravels, as Elon Musk and Trump falls out, as that happens, more and more people are contacting me and saying the behavior of that man, especially, for example, the callous remarks in the presence of the German Chancellor, shows that you actually made the right judgment call, that your view of him is vindicated, that there is no sense of orthodox diplomacy that is at work. So I think that as we begin to see that the things I predicted then are being realized, such as the scramble for critical minerals, such as the absolute disgraceful behavior with the South African delegation in the Oval Office, as the fallout with Elon Musk and the intensely personal nature of that fallout happens, people understand that there is no room at this moment with the USA for orthodox diplomacy.
We'll talk about that, but let me ask you what the reaction has been or the feedback you've had from outside the country to what happened to you in particular?
I've been really acclaimed everywhere outside the country, in the sense that, and particularly, I think that the world that is in solidarity with the Palestinians, they thought it was something fairly brave. It was an important sacrifice in standing for truth. I think that people have been coming up and saying your prediction about a supremacist instinct is being realized every day. And I think the very vulnerability and weakness of the Trump presidency is coming to light, that it is not that there is something superior that is driving it. It is out of a very deep fear of both domestic and global politics. Domestically, what I said was the changing demographics and voting patterns in the USA, and in a global sense, the fact that they're feeling besieged by the rise of multipolarity in the world, the rise of contending powers like China in the world, and the fallout of a trade war.
As an ambassador, of course, everything you say will get picked up, but it was more in a conversation, a discussion, than a formal speech where you were kind of outlining these for a very formal reception. Were you surprised it was picked up?
I was surprised. I'd been fairly careful. The institute that had invited me, I'd asked them to see their confirmation lists. They did it. I should have picked up that there was an issue when they didn't do the normal Chatham House rules, but I didn't. I should have picked up when they allowed someone who inscribed himself as anonymous was allowed even to ask a question. And what Anonymous asked sounded very much like someone that I was familiar with from my days in Cape Town, but more importantly, the one who led the campaign against me from the moment that I was announced, and that's Joel Pollack of Breitbart News, and that my hosts had in fact allowed anonymity on the platform because it was no longer the South African intelligentsia alone. But having seen that, and then waking up to Joel Pollack, for example, feeding very selected bits out of a 2-hour conversation onto the ether, I thought, yeah.
Just for perspective, his wife is South African, and he was at one stage being considered as a possible nominee for the position of US ambassador to South Africa. And he's a big Trump supporter, of course. And but for some people, it was a strange choice. But obviously, it seems you did have that interaction before. You've had some dealings, or
yes, because he wasn't just in America married to a South African. He was, in fact, the kind of strategist and speechwriter for the leader of the opposition, particularly in the years when I led the ANC in the Western Cape to defeat the DA from both the city council and the provincial government. So there's a lot of beef, if I can put it like that, that I think went down in addition to the contemporary issues that are at play.
Ambassador, I have to ask you to explain a quote of yours after coming back. It is good to feel the dignity of being African.
I think that particularly the USA, and maybe to a lesser extent the Western, Northern hemispheres of the world, have lost an enormous degree of civility. I think that there's no civility in the conduct of conversation. I think that they lose a lot of dignity in the pursuit of efficiency. I think that they've lost a lot of civility in the intensely robust and personal nature of their interactions and the conduct of their politics. And therefore, when an ambassador from a particular country comes in, his country is under attack, his government is insulted and demeaned, and the worst elements of that society who had oppressed South Africa are received in the White House and so forth, then you think, okay, this is diplomacy 202. To defend your country, you can't be the sheep that is smiling nicely. You've got to be as robust as what they are, but not crude and rude. Right. And I think that it's in that regard that it was really great to come back, that to feel this African dignity, because we grow up with a sense of Ubuntu, the interconnectedness of our humanity. We use that dignity and Ubuntu to settle with our former oppressors and reconcile with them despite the anger and the rage that may be beating in our hearts. We impose discipline upon ourselves in our conduct. When they see our former oppressors, that reconciliation is done on their terms, they will reconcile with you if you support their Springbok rugby team. And on those days, we will all be united. If they turn your heritage, and it's a heritage of genocide, of slavery, of frontier wars, of dispossession, but they turn it into a great pride day, a day to barbecue, rather than to reflect on where we've come from, and you reconcile with them, then you begin to understand that there's an extraordinary African dignity. And for me, it was just such a wonderful thing to escape the hostile atmosphere of Washington, particularly towards South Africa, and return to this warmth, this loving, dignified, even if you know that there are people at the airport who differed with you.
Well, you know, of course, Ubuntu, togetherness, unity, was very much the mantra of South Africa in the post-apartheid era. I wonder how you felt being or suddenly finding yourself in the crosshairs of the Trump administration.
I think that it demonstrates, therefore, that there is a hard edge to Ubuntu, that you don't sacrifice humanity in order to be humane. You don't turn a blind eye to inhumanity in order to be humane. And therefore, I felt that I had done my job. Of 200 plus ambassadors in Washington, there is one that was heard in the Oval Office. There is one that stung in the White House. There is one that moved a Secretary of State to issue a persona non grata declaration. I think I did live up to my standing for humanity, my standing against inhumanity, and for calling it out, whether it was the humanity of the Palestinians or whether it was even the humanity of those who are on the other side of supremacist instincts.
So presumably when you were having that discussion and those words were picked up, that was your intention, I guess, to highlight what you felt very strongly about?
I think it was an intention to prepare South Africa for the fact that the rules have all been eroded, that there is a different animal in the White House that do not operate by the normal diplomatic conventions, by normal trade negotiations. It is a warning that when you prepare your position on trade, brace yourself for the assault on your humanity. It was one to explain to them that on the basis of rumors of a genocide against white South Africans and the removal of their land from them, that already 8 billion rands worth of aid, particularly for HIV, AIDS, and other diseases, had been cut, not on the basis of fact-based interventions, but on the basis of receiving a delegation who alleged certain things, and on the basis of those allegations, a White House issued an executive order that suddenly meant 20,000 health workers out of work, 200 health clinics and facilities closed, that possible 1 million new infections with HIV. That is the dastardly nature of it.
We'll get into it, but I wonder, you did say you wish you'd been able to complete your time and achieve certain things that you'd hoped to while in DC. At any point, have you felt it was perhaps a misjudgment to put yourself in that position?
I think that I didn't feel it at the time, and certainly looking back, I don't feel it, because I felt that the mentality of the Trump administration is that they relent after they have a win. And so if the win for them was that they had my blood, and that opened the door to the president leading a delegation into the White House, then it would be a worthwhile thing. The other win that they may have thought that they wanted was to say, if you want to come in, you don't bring the new envoy along, as is the rumor mill in Washington, because this new envoy said even more blunt things about President Trump. And so I think that it's the mentality. If you can force Zelensky to say thank you for all the aid, If you can force Zelensky to sign a paper signing over all Ukraine's critical minerals, then we may consider what you need after you give us the win that we want.
Well, the White House rhetoric under Donald Trump has been quite sharp, as most people have discovered. But Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State who declared you persona non grata, called you a race-baiting politician and a Trump hater. Would you say that's a fair claim?
Hatred doesn't come easily to a South African. If we were taught not to hate, even those. I served in the Western Cape as a minister in a coalition government led by the last apartheid police minister, security minister. Now, hatred does not come easily to me. And so it's not about those kind of emotions. And certainly if race baiting is to regurgitate a fact that is at the center of Republican politics, that the white voting electorate is 48%, that there is the possibility, if all others were to denounce voting for that, then there would be effectively be a majority of minorities. And that's analysis by me. It's not race baiting.
Is that the argument you'd use to convince those, perhaps even supporters of Donald Trump, that your intention was not to appear as a race baiting politician and Trump hater?
I owe them no explanation.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't go out of my way. If anything, my interactions with the US after that would be what I would call the forces for change. Even if I disagree deeply with Democrats about how they conducted themselves regarding Palestine, the blindness with which they look at the expansion of NATO. I could disagree with all of them, but I see a modicum of touch points with them because I can appeal to them on human rights. I can have a conversation with them. There is a civility with them that despite the disagreements, I can conduct. So my job is not to deal with the MAGA forces to convince them. My engagements have been far more to say, how do we return the US to a rational entity that we can talk to again?
Well, that makes me wonder, your first stint as ambassador was from 2010 to 2015, just before Donald Trump came in, under President Barack Obama, the US's first black president. Describe to me how different that time was for you.
So, in the Obama era, I had the privilege of knowing him before I went to Washington because he visited Cape Town and had a lot of time here. So we got to know each other somewhat, and it's partially the reason that I was asked to go to Washington. And that was the time of the great upheaval in the Muslim world, particularly the Arab world. President Obama was willing to do what the establishment wanted him to do and to shut down the Arab Spring, but there was a rational conversation in which I could say to the president, in 2009 you went to Cairo and called the Arab masses to their finest when you called them to rise for human rights and freedom and democracy and all of, and they've answered you in 2011. Now you want to be the one to shut it down. And so that was the kind of hard, fundamental conversations.
Without retribution.
Without retribution. If anything, there seemed, and I'm not taking credit for it, but there was a way in which Obama allowed the Tunisian elections, allowed didn't enforce his red lines in Syria, allowed the Egyptian, he then had to relent to the establishment when the counter-revolutions happened. But what I'm describing is a robust, very dangerous moment in the geopolitical history of the world. And a South African ambassador, given our own history, coming from the land of Nelson Mandela, could at least be listened to and not dismissed out of hand. And so South Africans often have to act like the canary in the mine. When the oxygen is depleted, the canaries raise the alarm. Because our attuneness to the infractions on human rights, on democracy, on freedom and so forth are such that we can act like the canary in the mine.
On that note, it wasn't that long ago the canaries in the mine were starting to choke when your president, Cyril Ramaphosa, found himself in the crosshairs. So what was your reaction when you saw what a lot of people called an ambush in the Oval Office? You know, it was the biggest trending word on social media for a while.
No, I think that no amount of writing in a report that orthodox diplomacy has been eroded, prepare for a very robust thing, get all the trade and tariff negotiations done before you go to the White House, because the White House, Trump will exact another win from you there. He has to assert himself over you in the White House, but get the trade and tariff deals done before. So I'm hoping that all of those things are in place prior, so that the absorption of the punishment, the ambush in the White House becomes worthwhile. Not dignified, not great, but worthwhile at least. And so I think we understood that we're dealing with a different temperament. It was rather how much would we be able to bite our tongue in order to preserve that which was negotiated in the days leading to the Oval Office meeting.
Well, your quote at the time was, "Who was the adult in the room?"
No, absolutely. And that was so important for South Africans to see and for the world to see, that here the adult in the room was the one who retained dignity, kept a smile on his face, smiled through the lies, the sham TV show, the white papers branded about and so forth. And the adult in the room, knowing that every one of those so-called evidences were absolute lies. The adult in the room maintained dignity, because the adult in the room understood the greater picture was the trade and tariff things that would hurt South Africa, and the smaller picture was the assault on the dignity.
How did you rate the team, having people like Ernie Els, the golfer, go there, knowing that Trump is a big golfing fan and so on? How did you rate the kind of team that went with the president?
It's not an ideal team, because we all had to wince and smile through the tone deafness of Retief Goosen, who said, "You helped us in Angola," through the absolute throwing under the bus by saying what a violent country we are, etc. But the way I've explained it is that if you go as a president to China, you take your own translators along. If you go to the land of supremacism, you take your own translators along. Because those translators, the two golfers and the billionaire, acted like the translators from a rational black English, put it into a language that is palatable to a irrational white supremacist, and acted as the media. And so when our president says, we don't have a genocide, we're not confiscating land, one of those translators says, yes, it's true, President Trump, this is really not happening, you've got an exaggerated opinion, and translates it for President Trump. So that is the necessary, I almost called it evil, but that's a necessary compromise we needed to make in that White House.
That's interesting, going in with the psychology. Do you think President Ramaphosa learned a lot from the Zelenksy visit? Do you think there was some idea that, look, this is a chance that might happen to us as well?
So when I was still in place, I told President, this is not the time for you to visit too early. We must get our ducks in a row, because what we are trying to do is to prevent a Zelensky moment. Because there is nothing more pleasurable to a Donald Trump than to lord it over a black president. And
because he's white?
There's no other reason.
Okay.
Or he's just a bully by temperament. But the fact is that his MAGA movement expects him to prevail over a black president. And so the MAGA movement is fed this thing about Africa having S-hole countries, about, oh, we don't even know where Lesotho is, etc., etc. That's the kind of way in which it's red meat to that crowd. But the fact of the matter is that I think our president understood what he was going in for, conducted himself absolutely according to script. We bit and held our noses, bit our tongues and held our noses through that encounter. And hopefully the result is that South Africa comes out not good, but fairly okay.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Elon Musk. one of yours technically, who was in the room as well. And obviously things have changed a lot since that moment. How do you regard what's going on now between him and Donald Trump?
I think that Nelson Mandela always had the sense that sometimes a kraal is too small for two bulls. And I think it was bound to happen. Those two bulls needed each other. If Musk did not put in his billions or millions and did not put in his X into that, it's arguable whether Donald Trump could have prevailed, because Donald Trump 101 was a raging bull without an agenda. Donald Trump 202 had 200 executive orders prescribed for him, had a Doge in place, had everything. So clearly that input by Elon Musk and his coterie of other South Africans, Peter Thiel and Joel Pollack and David Sachs and all of them, had really created a sense of purpose amidst the madness. Before 101 was madness, this one was method in the madness that was coming to the fore. And I think that you can hold it for 2, 3, 4 months. Maybe you can patch it up again and go on for another year. But it's always going to be volatile, because the purpose and the madness have a dialectical relationship. Sometimes the madness overwhelms the purpose and hides the purpose, as is the case now, that the madness leads to a thing that could bankrupt the USA, the big beautiful bill. Or the purpose is just so compelling that it tempers the madness. And I don't think they found the formula between madness and purpose.
Well, they're both pretty unique characters. That obviously is part of it, isn't it?
No, that's exactly it. I think, and I say this with all respect, when you're on that kind of spectrum, the thing that could put your behavior on steroids is absolute power. Mm-hmm. Lots of people who do carry those quirks are usually confined and disciplined by the infrastructure around them. Imagine the infrastructure isn't there, and you've got two quirky characters running this massive machine. I mean, that's what we are seeing today.
How do South Africans regard Elon Musk now? What perspective do you think they have?
There was a grudging admiration. It's the kind of grudging respect that South Africans have for expatriates, whites, who left, who either fled because they feared a black majority, and they fled with their money and their skills. But we keep in this spirit of reconciliation, we keep an eye on them, and we can sometimes say, that's what South Africa gave them. This ability to establish PayPal, this ability to do the electric car, this ability to drive the rover on Mars, etc., etc. So there is a grudging respect for that, because it comes from the fact that they were born and bred in a country that has that kind of potential.
So to touch on something that's very much in the news since I've been here, does South Africa want or need Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system?
We don't need it. We may not want it, but we may have to get it. Because, and that will depend a lot on how much distance there is between the Trump administration and Elon Musk. Because up till that moment, the Washington Post, for example, had this expose on how a country like Bangladesh was railroaded into accepting Starlink as a precondition for tariff relief and trade reciprocation. And Lesotho was derided in Trump's State of the Union address. Lesotho is in the good books because Lesotho has Starlink now. Zimbabwe was absolutely pilloried, the pariah of the world. Zimbabwe is coming to the mainstream. It has Starlink now. There's a pattern. And the pattern is that the precondition for doing trade and tariff deals with the United States may have to be that you accept Starlink. Now, it's a business deal, but, and that is what is worrying the South Africa regulators, that how does a country as sophisticated as South Africa hand over its surveillance intelligence capacity to a foreign entity, and how do you put the necessary guardrails in place so that you may have to be forced to do the business deal, but not necessarily sell your intelligence and your surveillance capacity.
The irony is that Huawei, as a Chinese company, faced restriction because of the potential security risks. It's kind of there's perhaps a little irony here that we're seeing two issues on security handled in two very different ways.
And I think that puts pay to the idea that South Africa is simply a kind of tool of China because we put exactly the same kind of rules. I think it's a bit too early to prejudge whether Starlink will get the kind of free ride that Elon Musk wants, or whether we will have some paces to put them through in order to secure our country against intelligence leaks, surveillance capacities, and bypassing some of our business regulations.
A thought before moving on from Elon Musk, in this kind of conflict that's heating up between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, who do you think will win?
I think it could be MAD, mutually assured destruction. I think that the two bulls have different strengths, but it's the combination of the strengths that created this extraordinary moment for the USA in its attempt to dominate and regain lost ground in the world. And so, but if Elon Musk wins, it could be because they have a candidate who's waiting in the wings, recruited by the PayPal mafia and trained by the PayPal mafia and installed first in the Senate and now in the vice presidency. And that may be the win that the Musk crowd may have. And so it's no accident that when it was said, let's impeach Donald Trump and let the vice president take over. And I'm going to be very naughty based on my watching movies. Was that the moment that a Manchurian candidate steps in? I leave that question hanging.
Okay. Maybe we'll get back to you at some point and just see what happens, because I'd love to be able to discuss that further. Let's dig in a bit into the whole the farmer issue and the farmers going to the US as refugees, the land debate. How is that heating up here in South Africa?
When I came back from Washington, I took my car, went to the garage, and unlike the US where you throw in your own petrol, here you have garage attendants. And when they recognized me, they all came running up to me and saying, "Hey, Comrade Rasool, you were really, really brave. Thank you very much for standing up for us." And the white guy who thought that his car was being neglected by his attendant running to me, didn't know the pump was on automatic, he said, "Why are you doing?" And these guys, the petrol attendants, told me, "You know what? We're already being punished for taking his land. Why don't we just take their land?" So the point that I'm making is that the very things that we are being punished for and haven't done, the backlash may mean that there is a demand for South Africa to do those kind of things. If we have been slow on land reform, but we are now being punished for land confiscation, why don't we accelerate? If we are being punished for discriminating against whites and not giving them management and those jobs, there may be a demand. Why don't we accelerate the pace of transformation? And the same with the ownership on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I mean, 90+% ownership by white people. Why don't we accelerate? So what I'm saying is that there is an absolute disappointment that after 30 years of attempted reconciliation, you get this going to the White House, invoking a punishment on South Africa, and yet we have nothing to show for the allegations that are made against us, and therefore, should we not be accelerating the pace of transformation?
Now, if I heard it correctly, it's a phrase I haven't heard before. You said backlash.
I think so, because I think that, that maybe our white community thought that they were the only people whose feelings must be mollycoddled through 30 years of transformation. Maybe there was too much of an expectation that black resilience is just so secure that nothing can shake it. I think that not even poverty can shake your resilience as the idea that you are being insulted and punished for your patience. That suddenly you are accused of something that you have withheld yourself from doing. And that's what would be the essence of what I call a backlash.
Interesting, the cause and effect, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
So I've been looking at some of the media here, and I've seen that on the farmers issue, there have been some farmers who've been obviously supporting the idea of this land sort of claiming and them being basically persecuted. But there are some white farmers who've stood up and said, no, no, this isn't the case. How divided is the white farming community among this, from what you know?
No, I think it is one in which there is division.
Is it being handled the right way here?
I'm not too sure. I don't think that there is responsibility taking sufficiently from the white community, because in any given circumstance, populists always have a bigger megaphone. And those who know the truth are sometimes disabled by a grievance. So, no, crime is too much. Then I shut up on the truth. Oh, no, there's too many regulations in the offing. So let me shut up about the truth. Let me withhold myself from speaking truth to my fellow compatriots who share my color and my race and my ethnicity and my language. And so I don't think that there has been this urgency within the white community to be able to denounce very forcefully their compatriots, not even those who share power with us. It's always a no but. No, there is no genocide, but there is all these farm murders. And the farm murders over the last 10 years. I'm not saying it's horrific that anyone should be murdered. But 630 farm murders over the last 10 years. And when I say farm murders, not murders of whites, but also murders of black farm workers at the hands of those who now queue up for refugee status. I mean, I'm not speaking about in the apartheid years, but last year, 2 women picking up dairy products that are expired, shot, cut up, and fed to the pigs. Now, if you, as a white community, can't recoil from that and hold that up as, that's not us, not in my name, then I think you have a passion gap for your country, and you have a passion gap for the truth.
So I've seen these stories here in the South African media. And the twist is that Donald Trump, holding up those bits of paper and so on, described it as large-scale killing of white farmers. So in your eyes, is that misinformation, disinformation, propaganda? How is it being pushed? Because people outside hadn't really heard the story that much before.
Populism doesn't work on truth. It works on narration. The narrative must win. The truth is incidental. So that's true. That's black populists and that's white populists, or any Muslim populists, Zionist populism. And so in a very important way, truth is the casualty. But the fact of the matter is that when Donald Trump invokes all of that, there's no way that you can intervene in it with counterfacts. But the narrative is important, and the narrative of a genocide against whites, I think, has 2 functions. The one is that it gives white supremacism globally a victim that they needed. Because no supremacist ideology that wants to retake their place in the world can do so by showing that we own most of the economies, we dominate the stock exchanges, we do this, we do that. They need to find a victim to point to and say, that's why we must never relinquish control again in the world. So the second one is to create a false moral equivalence. Because South Africa took Israel to the ICJ on the charge of genocide against Palestinians, what better false moral equivalent to say, but South Africa is creating a genocide against whites. South Africa takes Israel to the ICJ for land occupation. What better moral false equivalence than to say, but you are taking the land of white farmers. So those are the two functions. The one is the victimhood, the other one is the false moral equivalence. And as I joked with US media, I said, on Donald Trump's definition of a genocide, he should be subpoenaed to the ICJ to be the star witness for the case against Israel, because his entry level for a genocide is so low that 70,000 Palestinian deaths will clinch it for South Africa in the ICJ.
That's a risky joke to be playing as ambassador in the US.
No, I wasn't ambassador then. I now speak with a better freedom.
Of course. So that's why I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying that narrative, the white farmer genocide claims, is linked to what's going on in Gaza and with the Israelis.
Look, there is no doubt that is the fundamental target. If you look at, for example, the executive order that cancelled all South Africa's aid and development assistance. Reason one, a white genocide and land confiscation in South Africa. Reason two, South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ for genocide and land confiscation, a close US ally. So from time to time, there will be tactical differences between the White House and the Knesset in Israel. Tactical difference. Is this the time to do the what's his name, the ceasefire? Is this the time for you to be attacking there and taking that, and so forth? But there are not strategic and values-based differences between the White House and Israel. That fundamentally remains, and that's the fundamental impudence that South Africa is being punished for, that it took Israel to the ICJ.
I'll ask you a bit more about that in just a second, but on that issue of the aid being cut off to South Africa, in reality, how much do you think it will hurt the country? And what options does South Africa have? Can other players outside in the international field step in and perhaps fulfill a bit more of that role? And could South Africa be more self-dependent?
I think South Africa, for example, on the PEPFAR, HIV funding, South Africa was already buying all its medicines, all its antiretrovirals from its own money. That's how much South Africa has stepped up over the years leading up to this moment. I think that where we are now being hurt is in the capacity to dispense the ARVs, because that's where the 20,000 health workers, the 200 NGOs and clinics come in. It's not that we have an absence of medicine, we have an interruption in the deployment of the antiretrovirals. On the other hand, we have a situation in which all the just energy transition funding has been stopped from the USA, and in that regard, for example, Europe sees South Africa's sacrifice, sitting on a mountain of coal but choosing renewable energy, sees that as a very critical sacrifice to be making that lets Europe a little bit off the hook for cleaning up their act, and therefore steps in to help South Africa with just energy transition funds. I've been to a conference in Istanbul where the Muslim philanthropy world and investment world gathered, and the rallying cry was there, if you want to support Palestine, support South Africa, because South Africa is being punished for supporting Palestine. So I think there's a consciousness. I don't think that there is a scale of alternatives that can make up for what South Africa has lost.
There is also a view among some analysts that the ability of people like Donald Trump to be able to push a populist agenda to this degree has helped fuel those populist agendas across Europe, for example, that perhaps even it might hit this country too to some degree, as we're seeing, cracks in the system here?
I think that it has hit South Africa. I think you've never seen a kind of rearming of a racial instinct amongst our white South Africans. They're walking with a spring in their step again. They've got a president in the White House that hears them and sees them. So I think that that sense is taking root here. I think it has emboldened Farage and Reform in the UK. Certainly the AFD, Vance himself came to campaign to them a week before the election. They've become the second biggest party. So I think that those things are there, stepping into the breach. Why is Marine Le Pen jailed in France, etc. But I also think that there is a counter movement. And that counter movement says that Akani in Canada, who was 30 points behind in the polls, when he stiffened his back against Donald Trump, he became Prime Minister. The same with the Labour Party in Australia. And so we can go on that there is a very interesting upwhelming on both sides of the equation.
I'm going to make it a little more personal here. Your family was forcefully evicted from land that was declared whites only. You lost that, and you've seen what can happen. Do you feel a need for justice for the past, personally?
My father did not apply to the Land Commission for the return of the house we lost in District 6, Cape Town, because he felt that freedom was enough revenge. For him now to be able to tell white people where to get off was enough of a revenge, rather than wanting that house. My uncle, on the other hand, has applied, and they've been paid out for the house they've lost. So there are different ways in which these things are working, but none of them would be working with a rage. People have queued up, gone through the process, asked for restitution and all of those kind of things, filled out all the forms. So in a sense, their rage has been bureaucratized, and later, after years, their patience rewarded. And so that's not an easy gene, a gene of rage to find in South Africa.
In fact, I think, coming from the outside, it's something that people perhaps outside don't always recognize, that's why it's called the Rainbow Nation. This ability to bring together people from different backgrounds and approach problems with different angles, perhaps. But you yourself, you've interesting situation. You're a Muslim from a family of mixed English, Javanese, Dutch, and Indian heritage. That gives you something of an advantage in terms of understanding what diversity is, I think, doesn't it?
No, I think that we've lived with a grandmother who was denounced by her white Dutch family, and who, until her dying day, refused to take a white pension, because she said she found a home in the black community and took a black pension under apartheid. So that's what we've grown up with. I've grown up with family on the building trade who have been under the thumb of their supervisors and owners. My mother, who broke her back in the clothing factories. So in a sense, I think we've grown up with this sense of diversity, and then on top of that, we've been taught by Nelson Mandela that it is, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, it is not the color of their skin, it's the content of their character. To look for the character in the white. That's why we could equally move, because we knew a Joe Slovo. We didn't hate a P.W. Botha, because we didn't hate whites, because we had enough white people in the struggle with us to immunize us against a counter-racism. And that's where this kind of idea of rainbowism. But when one color of that rainbow commits treachery by running to the White House, spreading a false narrative, and succeeding in punishing the very patient colors of that rainbow with more death and destruction, then I think rainbowism is in danger.
Well, in part two, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool talks about why he thinks South Africa has become a moral superpower for its stand against Israel at the ICJ.
That stirred the conscience, not just of the campuses in the US and the streets in the US and all over the world, but even young Jewish people who may not any longer have a grandmother or a grandfather who was physically in Auschwitz. And they could now think with their conscience and say, I'm Jewish, I enjoy being Jewish, I want to be Jewish, I may even love Israel, but I will not give a blank check to Netanyahu to achieve the end game that he has in mind.
He reveals what President Nelson Mandela told him on Islamophobia and also why Donald Trump might be driven by vanity to come to the G20 meeting in South Africa. Finally, why Ambassador Rasool believes his expulsion from the USA as ambassador is a badge of honor.
I think that it says there was one ambassador who stood up and didn't take the BS. It says that there's one who had the courage to stand by the values. And so I think that for me, it's absolutely a badge of honor.
Join us for that. I'm Riz Khan. Thanks for watching. See you soon.